Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Issei become a god part 2. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video and also share this video with your friends. I have created my other videos playlist, there you can watch my all videos easily, check out as well. Let's start this video. She cupped her hands over her mouth, suppressing her urge to throw up the little substances she had eaten since housing him. Her eyes lost their burning golden color and she looked at the treetops once more. She watched as they looked at her and drew their weapons. She hoped they wouldn't attack, but she knew this was a situation where they would certainly engage. She prayed her stars were still aligned to grant her this want. But it would appear her stars had just unaligned. From the treetops they jumped, blades drawn, magic flames coating fists, and behind them were magic circles for support and offensive magic from a distance. Each group that took turns guarding her were the finest of the Kyoto supernatural world. Each group was trained to work in perfect syzygy with one another, and each group had members to cover the weakest link. They were literal super units, and at the moment, they had intent to eliminate the threat that destroyed bits of the Osaka Manor, and that energy was directed at Issei Hyodo, the boy she wanted to save. How could things have gone so wrong? He watched, not fully in control of his own body anymore. He floated in darkness, but he could see. He was standing in the rain, there was a girl approaching him, her long golden hair flowed behind her as she stared at him with large golden eyes on stalks. He didn't understand fully, but everything the girl had been saying brought him anger. She sounded like his mother, always caring and nurturing, how a mother should be. Vision flashed in his head. His mother and father were suspended by a series of piano wires that used his furniture as pulleys played on repeat in his head. He knew the killer was gone. He knew he delivered the blow that sent him to hell, but he still wasn't happy. He wanted them back. He wanted things to turn back to normal. Tears began to flow down his face, disappearing into nothing as they fell endlessly. He stared out as the tears continued to pour. He was inside his body now, he was back in control, but he wasn't sure he wanted it anymore. He would much rather watch as someone else lived for him. Where am I? What is this place? He turned around as fast as he could, his reflexes seeming to be above his processing speeds. Charging at him from the treetops were easily a dozen figures, all dressed in cloaks and wearing fox masks. He swiped his arm, instinct taking over him in response to the attack. Wind exploded out in a shockwave in front of him, sending the figures away from him and forcing them onto their feet, no longer hidden by the foliage the trees provided. He looked at the people closely, their weapons all drawn and directed at him. Some had flames around their fists, and others had giant circles with intricate designs in front of them like shields. He looked at the katanas that the people held. He saw the throats of some of them move, as if they were trying to speak to him, but his vision was tunneled and his ears were ringing as the only thing he could think of was his parents. Rage boiled in him, mixed with the power of Drake, which caused his blood to feel as though it were burning like magma inside him, itching to be released. He replayed the scenarios over and over in his head, only adding to the fire, but he couldn't stop himself from guessing at the grandeur of his situation. He walked home from school on that fateful night and was asked out by a girl that was far out of his league, only to return and find his parents were brutally ripped apart and taken from him for no reason, where he then died trying to run, only to be forcefully awakened in a hospital. He knew he died on the first night, he felt his life leave himself in a feeling that was so ethereal to him, it should have been impossible, but he was slung back into the world of the living by force, where only seconds later. He watched as people burned to their untimely demise in a hospital that should have been impossible to burn down. He walked through flames like he was used to it and watched as people in rooms had their charred bodies burnt even more, as if the flames had forgotten something and needed to burn more. Not only that, now he had a voice in his head that spoke to him during the day, claiming to be a dragon of domination and power, and told him sweet nothings in a voice he knew was hiding something sinister, and in his dreams, the dragon visits him, appearing as a huge-scaled monstrosity that always smiled down at him. He always smiled back, refusing to show too much fear for a created existence inside his imagination. He was driven to the point of rage and let himself be consumed by that rage. He wasn't in control of his body when he started attacking the killer, and despite that, he felt satisfaction at beating him to a bloodied pulp. He would do it over and over again for the rest of eternity if he was given the option to. He remembered being engulfed in flames and feeling the pain as they burned hotter than any he had felt inside the hospital. And now he was here. In an unknown place, surrounding and getting attacked by people he didn't know and had never met before. Everything had been a slightly different repeat of the last event. He would wake up, fight, die. Wake up, fight, die. Wake up, fight, die. What was going to change this time? He began to understand more now as he continued staring at the people before him. He would be repeating the cycle this time as well. Everything began to fall into place. I get it. The people seemed to relax slightly, but immediately put their guard back as they realized he was talking to himself. He began to move to the people with their shiny tools and fancy weapons. A smile grazed his face, and the dragon laughed in his head, muffled. I am finally understanding. His body slumped over, rain poured from the sky with a new ferocity. Red energy erupted around him, and just as this happened, a single dragon wing exploded from his right shoulder, sending blood and water and a shotgun spray of pellets that would feel like needles for someone unfortunate enough to be in the way. I'm in hell. I died with my parents, and now I'm here playing a devil's sick game. Power erupted around him to a new height that caused the armed people to back slightly away. He crouched down low, preparing himself to lunge, red power shooting off him in waves, slicing drops of water as they fell, and sending the water away from him. Well, I refuse to accept that. I won't do it. I won't accept it. He lunged, the air around him exploded, and the ground beneath his feet shattered. One of the men charged at him, blade held at the ready. Issei's eyes followed the man intently, the blade went up, the man was aiming for a vertical swipe, but Issei was faster. His wing thrust down, thrusting him to the left slightly, and causing the sword to miss by only a finger's breadth. His fist was covered in red energy, and scaled over with sharpened finger plates. He drilled his fist into the stomach of the man. Blood flowed from below his mask, but the man was far from being dead, and he could tell that with just a touch. You're the strongest of the Red Dragon Emperors. Let it be known on the battlefield, rend your foes useless, and render them to nothing but messes under your feet. Pave the path to success with ruin. He grabbed the man by his collar and threw him at the group of others, using him as a bowling pin. He collided with several of the men, sending them flying backwards in a ball. Behind him, he sensed another come at him from above, and with reflexes faster than a predatory cat, Issei sidestepped, the katana flashing past him as it glistened in the rainfall, reflecting his piercing green eyes back into his soul. He started to laugh at his own misfortune. It has always been this way. The voices he heard that night at the hospital flooded into him once more, and he breathed in their revelations. He pulled his fist up and delivered a blow, so powerful to the gut of his attacker. As his fist connected, a shockwave exploded behind the man, sending the rain rippling away and leaving the area around him and the rest of the men silent. The man went flying back into the forest, but Issei could still see he was alive as he flew through the air. It was like he was holding back unconsciously. He turned to the others and stared blankly at them, rain slammed down into the ground around them, filling his ears with the hard pattering of water on the muddy surface at his feet. The men stared at him, all taken aback at how fast he had set two of them spiraling without much of an effort. He was unmoving as he looked at them, but he suddenly hunched down and took off once more, his feet slamming into the ground with loud pounding sounds after each step. The men broke from their group and surrounded him before he knew it. They rushed him with the weapons drawn, some stayed back as their circle of magic grew in power and fired spears of energy his way. His eyes moved and everything slowed, as if the men tried to move to him through syrup. He began to walk, the scales began to take over his left leg, covering the appendage in red, razor-sharp scales. He moved to the men moving in slow motion, running without the restriction they had. He delivered a kick to one, causing a loud burst of red, as red energy sent the man spiraling towards two others in the blink of an eye. The others halted their attacks and looked towards him. His eyes didn't focus on the guards. Instead, they focused behind them, where gold eyes met green ones, but they weren't the eyes from the girl he saw at the hospital. It was a little girl, staring at him with all the terror he had ever seen, as her older doppelganger held her in a tight embrace. His head began to hurt and his armor dispelled. His wing faded into red energy that melted with the rain. He fell to his knees, the green leaving his eyes. He looked at the ground, the realization of what he had done pounding into his head with the brute force of a jackhammer that sent his head in a fit of thundering aches. His mind forced his thoughts on what he had just done. How many families was he about to ruin? He closed his eyes as he counted each person that he sent flying in a fit of their own blood. He looked at the ground for only a second, seeing the red blood mixed mud he fell in, and knew he was no different from the man who did this to him. He looked at the small girl, and she moved away from his gaze in fear of him. He didn't want any of this. He looked up to the sky as rain pelted his face, his eyes burned from his own regret and sadness. Soon, tears mixed with rain fell freely from his eyes. Make it stop, he began. Make this pain end. Everyone seemed to stop, weapons sheathed in a display of trust when none was deserved. Issei Hyodo. We mean you no harm, please settle down. You refrained from killing my guards, so I know that you were not in your right mind, but you tried fighting. The voice belonged to a girl, the same girl that tried to calm him when he first awoke. He looked towards her, his bloodshot eyes locking with her golden ones. She stood, her younger equivalent standing beside her. I can't take it anymore. I died with my parents, and now I keep living a constant nightmare. I died and woke up in a hospital and died again. God, make it stop, make it stop, make it stop. She couldn't help it as a piece of her heart shattered at his rant. Her men were still alive and she knew they would make a full recovery from simply sensing them, but she wasn't sure if Issei would ever make a full recovery. His eyes were so dead and void of life it was unlike anything she had seen. She had seen the looks of people who had lost everything and was forced to live through it, but she couldn't imagine what was coursing through his head. He believed he died and was now playing some devil's game for some sick enjoyment that always ended in his death. She didn't know how to tell him the truth or how to even approach it. It was so far beyond her understanding and experience. Issei, you are not dreaming. Why do you think you are dead? Do you know what it's like to awake in a hospital moments after dying, only for it to be lit ablaze by someone you swore to kill? Do you know what it's like to listen to people burn to nothing when you could have done something? I ran out of that building without regret and faced the only reason for all of this, not caring about the lives of others. I'm a monster. You saved the life of 2 girls, Issei. You gave life to 2 people who would have died. You changed their lives in a way they can never repay. You lived when you left the building, Issei. You fought the man who killed your parents and won. You are alive and you can live for your parents. That's what they would want for you. The boy looked at her, his eyes changed. She saw a new fire burn behind her eyes and she knew at that moment that the dragon had revealed something that she couldn't quite explain. Whatever it was, she was thankful that Drake decided to help her for whatever reason. The boy began to laugh. It was low at first and slowly it began to rise with each breath until he was laughing as loud as he could, tears streaming down his eyes. For my parents. Live for my parents. She took the opportunity to stand and approach the boy carefully. Yes, live for them. Show the world who you are, let them know that the best of people sometimes has the roughest history. Don't let the hate for someone who is gone now send you spiraling into despair and ruin. You can be so much better, so much stronger. You can protect those you care about and stop others from suffering the same as you. You can protect those you care about. The people I care about are gone. He interrupted, his eyes shadowed now as he looked down. Then make new people you care about. I am determined to give you a good life in as many ways as possible. She continued to approach him, slowly, but getting closer with each second. She studied him closely, his skin becoming paler with each passing second. She felt the same pinch of fear she felt at the hospital that she swore and hoped was wrong. The boy coughed, the action produced a cackling noise that sounded as if something slushed around deep in his throat. She began to move faster to the boy, her worry taking hold, but she hoped her suspicion was wrong, but as she approached, he bellowed over, blood spurting from his mouth with each body-rocking cough he had given. Her eyes opened wide. Her hope had been crushed once more that night. He was dying from his incomplete transformations into Juggernaut Drive. Forbidden power then used the life force of the host as endless amounts of energy. It was a cataclysm of power that exploded inside the user, damaging the body, soul, and mind of the host in ways unimaginable. She rushed to him at that moment, grabbing him in an attempt to hold him up. She looked at his face, and she had never done something so brutal. Blood from his mouth was something she expected and was prepared for, but the blood that took the place of his tears, as well as the small bit his nose was losing, gave her worries he could never imagine. She felt the energy leave him completely, but his eyes roamed around, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Her body began to glow golden, and his body did as well, but she knew it was going to be an even bigger struggle from this point forward to keep him alive. It was going to take a miracle, and the easiest way to save him would be played on Drake's part, and she wondered what chaos in the world it would bring. Help me get him inside. He looked around and recognized where he was immediately. It was the same narrow corridor dimly lit by flickering torches that danced on the edge of death's wake. He knew where he had to go, and he remembered what transpired to his arrival here. He began to walk, the shadows shifting wall to wall, forming figures in the corner of his eyes, where he would never dare look in this place of madness. He had remembered what he did to the girl who wanted to save him, what he did to those who protected her. He refused to become the thing he swore to kill that night with the dragon of madness that he knew awaited him at the end of his road every night. With each new step, the silence pressed closer and the darkness followed closer, making it difficult for him to catch his breath. He walked for what could have been hours, the figures in the corner of his eyes attacking each other and some staring at him with their shaded bodies and red eyes. He remembered the girl that stared at him with terror in her eyes and saw himself. He was the one who showed her that fear and he felt the regret inside of himself. He couldn't do it. He wouldn't be able to stand himself if he continued his rampage. A chamber formed in front of him, the shadows whispered incoherently behind him. He walked into the chamber that was endlessly wide and endlessly tall, and despite not being able to see the walls that made the place a chamber, he knew they were there. An illusion of his brain refusing to focus on the horrible truth. Before him stood a mirror that he approached unreluctantly, and as his reflection appeared, his expression in the mirror was the exact opposite of the one he had been wearing since walking in the place. The reflection looked calm and older. A perfectly straight face with an innocent smile, but the eyes showed alternate feelings, deranged insanity. The scary part was how calm he looked with all the hate, rage, bile, and vanity that he knew was hidden behind the eyes of his reflection. He stepped closer though, knowing what to expect and knowing he wouldn't look away regardless. Behind Issei formed a giant red dragon he had recognized as Drake. He felt the presence build behind him and knew that there was something behind him. But he knew better than to turn. "You are dying once again, boy, and once more, you approach me for help." He stared at the dragon in the mirror, not replying. He knew he didn't need to. The dragon knew what he was thinking. "So, what will it be this time for power? Your humanity? Your soul?" "Our souls are already one," he replied, and the dragon smiled. "Perhaps, but there is always more to the story. You want to live. I want you to live. You are the strongest partner I have ever had, and the arrival of the fox named Yasaka will be your greatest chance of succeeding where all others failed. What if I refuse?" "Refuse what?" "Let me explain your situation. You use Juggernaut Drive, the one fail-safe that is supposed to kill the host of me. That ability is forbidden and runs solely on the life force of you. You are dying, and I refuse to let you die, and deep down, I know you fear death. You can lie, but the truth is there is a book for me to read. You want power to protect those who you care about, and though your parents are gone and the damage is still there, you want to find a new one. You lie. Do I, little one? You said it yourself, our souls are linked. I see what you see and feel what you feel. I know what you think and see everything about you. I've seen worse than you and have done worse than you could ever imagine. I am destruction and chaos, and you wear the clothes to be the prince of everything." He didn't reply, he didn't know how. "So, what will it be then, my child? What sacrifice is it this time that will breathe life into you anew?" He looked at the dragon in the mirror. His thoughts shifted to the girl and her mother, then to the girls he saved and the people at his school. His friends, and even the ones that hated him. He wondered if they were rooting for him. He wondered if they felt sorry. He wanted to go back. He wanted to be strong. He wanted power. But what price would he pay to obtain it? He thought of his predicament and knew his death was inevitable if he said anything else. His decision was made and prayed he would stay the same. "My humanity." The dragon smiled, as though his master plan had gone perfectly. "Your heart is then. I like you. The willpower you have is more than anyone I have ever seen, and given the wars I have fought, that means a lot. You will keep a human appearance, and your strength and life will be increased. Prepare yourself, little one. It's time to become a dragon." He felt pride at the praise the giant dragon gave him. He smiled, genuinely, with no other intention aside from a smile, but the burn that began to form in his chest was what took that away from him. He fell to his knees, but the ground below vanished. His body began to glow gold as the burning came and went in waves. He felt something grab onto him, and the comforting glow came from the world where he lay unconscious. The pain had left and was replaced with a feeling of idle pulsing and slight aching. He knew who it was that was helping him as he looked at the golden energy. And even after all he had done, she still wanted to help him. He looked in the direction where he knew she was, but he only saw the vastness of the chasm that surrounded him. He opened his mouth to speak and hoped she would hear him whisper the only words he knew to say to her. The only words that could never truly explain how he fully felt towards her in that moment. Despite all the troubles, she stayed persistent to help him. Like a mother would for her children. A tear rolled down his eyes, vanishing below him. He knew his mother was gone. He accepted it, no matter the pain it brought him, because that's what his mother would want. To live. "Thank you." She looked at the boy as she laid beside him, her body nude and glowing golden. She knew it wasn't correct and she wasn't taking advantage of him. She wanted him to live, no matter what it would cost, and Senjutsu worked better with more skin contact. She was willing to do anything to save the boy and help him through his pain. She couldn't bear seeing him moan in pain as his magic literally attacked his body. She knew he was going to live once she saw it happen, but she would help him through the process because she knew pain could kill the weak, and given his past events, she knew that would be a deadly thing for him. She looked at him and saw his lips moving. Her eyes grew for a second as she thought he was going to speak, but she closed them seconds later as nothing was said. Her eyes widened once more. She heard the faintest of whispers that made her eyes water. "Thank you." His vision was fuzzy, muddled, and he couldn't grasp the gravity of his surroundings or even begin to make sense of it. He was surrounded by a bewildering mess of invisible things, touchless and usable, but constantly grazing past him with an intangible space between. The place where his eyelid was thick like syrup, but he breathed fine. He moved against an invisible glob of mass that seemed to sap his energy, pulling further and further into a vast unknown. He had tried moving, but found the darkness and escape to be the one inevitable constant in the sea of black, where he swore monsters lurked below him, waiting to break the ceiling to the only world they had ever known to lunge at him. And he sunk closer to that edge with each passing second, but knew he would never reach it. He knew he was moving, but he knew he wasn't as well. The feeling was strange as he felt the substance lick past him, ruffling the hair on his arms and the back of his neck. He looked down at himself, seeing his body, as though it were a light shining in darkness. His hearing was impaired as an amalgamation of sounds bombarded him, both whispers, low and deep, and mangled roars of fury and anger. His body tingled the more his thoughts were left to himself, every part of him was immovable and numb. The numbness that was just enough to remind him he was still present, but making it impossible to know where he was present. It was a scary feeling that made him feel outstretched yet shorter, as if his body was both larger and smaller than he could grasp. He felt both bigger and smaller than normal, and his head ached at the thought alone. He had only the faintest sense of self-consciousness and an even more vague sense of shape. He was confused and panicked, but he couldn't reflect anything as his mind ran rampant. He was curious, and he didn't know how to be cautious at all. His control over himself was impossible. It was like he was the observer of his own fate, and he was there for the rollercoaster of pain and terror by some bigger entity for a sick twisted game of torment. Time was warped in his head, and he was consumed by appalling vistas of years that seemed to outstretch beyond him endlessly, forcing his head to pound as it struggled to grasp the metal of his own unknowable situation. He felt isolated in a single point, where the present was a misty haze of gray, acting as an island that floated in the black seas of infinity. How long had he been here? Days? Years? Seconds? Suddenly, the void shifted and filled with a shifting kaleidoscope of colors and light that whizzed past him faster than his eyes could keep pace. Stars formed and almost blinked out like the torches in the corridor, and the feeling of thousands of years passing had dawned on him as he was forced to remember the life of a star. The colors began to slow, coming into focus and solidifying around him into a solid picture, but doing so slowly to antagonize him. The sounds began to lessen, the whispers slowed, and the roars faded out, and soon he began to hear specified things enter his cochlea. But the sound slowly transforming into words he could comprehend steadily, the feeling of self-awareness began to rise, and he knew he was no longer simply existing, but that he was now observing. And then he could see them. "Issei, do you want to go and see your friend Irina?" It was his mother who asked the question. Both his father and mother looked down at him. His heart crushed what he had left to hold onto. He wanted to fall to his knees, but he couldn't. He was forced to run to his mother, squealing happily to see his friend. His eyes stung and his chest hurt. He doesn't want to live through these memories. He tried to open his mouth and begged for it to stop, but the only thing he could say were responses so old he had forgotten. He was guided by the hand of his mother out the door into a brighter place, filled with the happiest of colors: green, blue, yellow, red, pink, and purple. He had forgotten how beautiful his mother's yard had been at the time. It was something he would always look past. He tugged against his mother's hold and looked at the flowers in great interest. "Oh? You want to look at the flowers?" His mother smiled down at him and guided him to the flowers. She kneeled beside him as he adored their beauty. He looked at the masterpiece his mother had created. Healthy green grass and rich soil gave birth to the most beautiful of flowers. Purple flowers, full and flush, laid a bed that formed the first layer to the replica of what he could assume was a slice of paradise. The purple flowers are called chrysanthemum. I know, it's a big silly name, but it has a beautiful meaning. Did you know every flower has different meanings? The purple ones mean something simple: honesty. His pain and sorrow washed away as he listened to his mother speak to him. He would never forget the names he was being told now. He would remember them forever. He pointed to the next layer, saying something that he couldn't hear. "Those pink ones there are zinnia. They are one of my favorites. They serve as a reminder to never forget absent or lost friends. They are pretty, aren't they? With their bright yellow center, it's almost like they have their own personal sun." The next layer was blue and red. They look like fluff balls of cotton, but their deep elegant blue and energetic red had caught his attention. "Those are cornflowers. They are as simple as they are beautiful. They mean good fortune and wealth." He didn't need to point at the last one. "The last ones are camellias. They can mean a lot of things. I planted them for you," in red. "The love for a new family member. Naturally, camellias can mean you trust destiny in the hands of someone else. It gives you a reason to live." Everything began to fade away at her words. He turned his head to look at his mother and saw her begin to fade in a flurry of colors. He turned and looked around, the ground began to disappear, and soon he found himself in the same place as before. Floating amidst a black sea of infinity, where things seemed to be irrelevant. He didn't want to awake from that dream. He wanted to go back. It's time to face destiny, little one. Don't resist it, I know your feelings, but I see what you cannot, and I know things you couldn't comprehend. I am just as much you as you are me now. He didn't need to look to know who had spoken to him in his time of loss, but the truth behind his partner's words hid the lack of friendliness. He knew the dragon was correct. Things began to come to focus in odd colors. He was being swept away by black winds through gulfs of fathomless gray as needle-like pinnacles began to move miles below him, eyes watching him. Revelation hit him in a moment. He wasn't alone in the darkness. He felt a hideous fear clutch him. Chapter 4, Chrysanthemum Camellia. He awoke with a startled lunge, beads of sweat dripping down his face as he was grabbed by tender arms in a loving embrace. It's okay. It was all a dream, you're alright now. It was smooth and soothing. The girl was soft, and her hands moved like silk as she drew designs on his back. The movement was comforting and reminded him of the games his mother would play with him whenever he awoke from bad dreams. The memory brought him sadness at first, but he couldn't help playing the game as an all too familiar shape was drawn on his back. "Art, you drew a heart." She smiled at his answer. He was okay and responsive. That was more than she could have hoped for given the prior situation she found herself in. She was happy with the outcome of her actions, finally. "My mother would always draw shapes and patterns on my back when I awoke from nightmares. She would also do the same when I had trouble sleeping at night in storms. I was always scared of thunder." He let out a low chuckle as he finished, and Yusaka flinched slightly. The chuckle had let out more emotion than she had heard before, and it was chilling, but it was progress. She didn't need to say anything, she knew he would continue. "Actually, I was having a dream about her before I awoke." She stopped drawing shapes. She perked up and let him go. She sat across from him and completely forgot she was naked at all, but he didn't seem to pay any attention at all. She knew from the information she gathered about his previous life, this was a reaction that was not normal for him. What kind of dream, Issei? She was afraid to know, and she hoped deep down it wasn't a dream of the murder she had seen so much of in pictures. She couldn't imagine how horrible it was to witness the whole thing once, nonetheless, experience it twice. He seemed to stare at nothing, at a single place on her stomach. He paid no attention to her bare skin, but much rather seemed interested in the world he was living in his own head. He suddenly shifted his head to make eye contact with her. Her eyes widened slightly at what she saw in his eyes. His brown eyes were encased in a thin, barely noticeable green ring that seemed to radiate more power than she cared to admit from a teenager. "She showed me her flower garden. I had forgotten all about them until that dream." He looked away from her, his eyes meeting something on the wall that wasn't there. "She told me what each flower meant. It was nice. I kind of wish I could stay there, it was so peaceful. But I know I have to keep moving." "Flowers? Which flower in the garden was your favorite?" She had been alive for a long time, and she knew her flowers well, and asking him this question forced him to move his thoughts along and think about himself in the present. "Camellias?" Her eyes widened only slightly. She wasn't expecting that, but it brought her happiness and hope. "Camellias? You trust your destiny in the hands of someone else. They are beautiful, aren't they? Pink perfection." There were many colors for the flower, but the most common one was pink. Each color had an additional meaning, but they all meant roughly the same. Yeah, they were. She planted them red, and she told me she planted them for me. They were wonderful, standing above the other bushes of flowers, so well preserved. It's funny now, I've never really cared much for flowers. But I can't help myself. There was sadness in his voice that didn't go unnoticed by her. She reached for his left hand and held it in hers. "Some people find happiness in the littlest of things, Issei, and that's okay. It's the values of the little things that mean the most." "Yeah." She looked at him closely, the response was meaningless and was anti-progressive to how she was moments ago. How he replied showed that he had zero interest in continuing the conversation, and as sad and anxious as that made her, she understood why with each additional thought to what he had said. She looked down at herself, her bare chest exposed. She picked up her left arm and used it to cover her semi-erect nipples from the chilly air of the bedroom she was in. She rolled her right arm down her stomach and planted it between her legs. The warmth it brought her was comforting, but it felt wrong to think of it as anything other than just covering herself. Her thoughts were cut off as she heard his stomach growl, deep and low, and his face flinched in pain at the sound. She jumped up and got off the bed, getting dressed as fast as she could. The task wasn't hard for her at all as she wore her traditional shrine maiden kimono wherever she was. She slipped the kimono over her shoulders and slung her normal white coat over the kimono and tied the two in place by a red ribbon at her waist. "You must be hungry, I'll go cook some food. Do you have anything in mind that you would like?" she asked, crossing her arms under her chest, unconsciously lifting her assets up towards him. She knew what she was doing, she was seeing how much of the old him was left, and she hoped there was more left than the new. He shook his head in disregard to her question. She lowered her arms, she took a breath, and hoped it was just from being uncomfortable, but this was something she would need to try and fix. She knew he was still spiraling in a labyrinth of bad thoughts and hurt, and she had a feeling, if she could pull him out, he would make a good recovery to be his normal self. Would you like to come with me, then? I'm sure my daughter would love to finally talk to you. She looked at him as he suddenly threw his head up and locked eyes with her. She stared deep into his chestnut brown eyes and saw a burning will to go. Her eyes widened slightly at the sudden action and movement. Your daughter, he asked, his question rushed out. She was shocked now, her mouth hung open as she tried to say something. Her mind was now curious, he had broken out of his cage at the mention of his daughter. So, he had some connection to the girl that she couldn't possibly understand. She was going to use this to aid her in any way possible. She was now very curious. Yeah? Kunu is my daughter. I'm sure she will like you, she has always wanted a friend to play with. She said, turning and moving towards a drawer. She pulled a kimono out and handed it to him. He looked at it carefully, and realization dawned on him suddenly and almost comically as she saw the registration crawl over his face. He looked down suddenly and then looked around. He grabbed the kimono with a vigor that was completely new to what she had seen from him. Why you were naked with me in the bed, his face flushed red and stayed that way as he slung the kimono over his shoulder and tied it together with a golden ribbon at the front. His blush never faded and the confusion never left his face. She smiled brightly. He was still there, deep down inside. She was happy, maybe for strange reasons, but she knew this was an amazing start now. She wondered why he acted so cold after their talk though, she had several ideas, but none made sense. Yeah, she was going to have some fun with this, how could she not? What's the problem with that? Does your husband know? He asked. He leaned away from her slightly and threw his arms up slightly in defense. Husband? I don't have a husband. Wait, were you worried about that? Are you trying to say something to me? She brought a hand up to her mouth and widened her eyes at him in shock. She faked her blush as best as she could, and it seemed to work as he became even more flustered. And no, I didn't mean anything. He stammered out. She decided to let the poor boy free this time. She was happy enough he had shown traits of his previous personality. She turned and motioned him to follow her. Come on then, Issei. I'm sure you are very hungry and your phone is there beside you if you have anyone to contact. Your messages were well. Blowing up. Popular much. He turned after standing, and true as she said, his phone lay delicately on a table beside the bed, plugged to an outlet by a charger that he immediately recognized as his own. It was wrapped in cloth, red and black designed. He smiled, that was his favorite color scheme. He reached for the phone and placed it in his pocket before turning and following the girl out the door with new questions he hadn't yet asked. Kuo Academy. It had been close to a month and a half since the announced death of Issei Hyodo at her school, and she still felt the crippling weight of shame weigh heavy on her shoulders. She looked up from her lap, where she twiddled her thumbs in anxiousness. All around her, the members of the kendo club sat with their heads hung low. She couldn't blame them, they all remembered what they did to Issei the night of his parents' murder. How could they forget? They had caught his friends peeping, but when they had reached them, they ditched Issei who seemed to have only just arrived, but instead of hearing him out, they all took the opportunity to beat him for the mistake of his friends. She felt terrible, she looked down at her hands and felt sick. She was disgusted and ashamed. She never minded his perversion, but she always took the lead to punish him for them. She was jealous. She enjoyed his peeping, not his friends, but she didn't want him to peep at anyone else. He was the first guy she had ever interacted with genuinely, and beyond his perversion, he was caring, loving, and showed his willingness to help others. She remembered how well she was always treated by him when she actually needed the support. She remembered the day she dropped her lunch in the dirt on the day of her school's first co-ed cultural festival, and he came to her as she sat under the shade of a tree, beads of sweat trickling down her face from the hot humid air of summer. She remembered how he handed her his lunch, all wrapped up in a neat red cloth. She refused at first, but after his insisting, she accepted. It was the first meal given to her by a guy, and it was also the first time someone had shown an interest in her well-being. And after that, she had always felt close to him, but regardless of those feelings, she would always side with the members of the kendo club and beat him when they found him peeping. She joined the group at school who ridiculed him, called him a pervert, and the worst part was she didn't feel bad at all about siding with the other students. Siding with them secured her position in the rankings of people at the school. She hated herself for it now. She was ashamed and felt small. Her walls came crashing down when he was announced dead. She broke down on the spot, unable to control her tears. She had lost someone who had only ever shown her kindness, when in return, she showed him hatred, even when there was none inside her towards him. She was pathetic. When it was revealed the next day that he had somehow survived the attack with horrible injuries, she wanted to talk to him, she needed to, but she didn't know how, or if he would even talk back. She didn't know when he would wake up, and for the longest time, the thought was that he wouldn't wake up at all. She cried again at that news, and she begged her parents to go and see him, but regardless, they weren't allowed to see him. News reporters were shut out, and police were becoming stricter with each passing day, and her anxiousness was becoming overpowered with sadness. She wanted to see him, but no one was allowed. He had no family, and perhaps that was why she wanted to go more with each day. To show him that someone was there for him, caring, even when she wasn't a good friend at all. She pulled her phone from her pocket and looked at the screen as it flashed into life under the table she was sitting at. She scanned her fingerprint on the back of the phone, and the screen flashed to her homepage, where she immediately moved to her messages. She clicked on the name she had never had in her phone until prior, Issei Hyodo 3. She felt childish having his name with the heart at the end, but it brought her comfort, so she kept it. She looked at her last message when she couldn't bring herself to read, or it would bring her to tears. Sent and unread. She looked at his name at the top. Offline. Since her first message to him, she had kept her phone on her at all times, hoping for something back from Issei. Her heart always skipped beats when she got a message, but her shock faded when she found out who the messages were sent from. None of them from who she wanted it to be. She moved the phone back into her pocket and stood from the table. She gathered her things and slung them over her shoulder, catching the eyes of the other members who watched her with careful eyes. Hadis? Are you okay? She turned and looked at her friend in question. Brown hair tied in twin tails by red ribbons, and brown eyes that looked downcast stared at her in confusion. Yeah, I just want to go home. She replied, looking into her friend's eyes and speaking the language of telepathy to her. Murayama nodded, understanding the reasoning for her friend leaving. I see, I'll talk to you later then. Murayama said, yawning from her lack of sleep that showed from the barely noticeable bags below her eyes. Cadis nodded to her friend and continued her trail outside the room and into the main hall of the school. Several students remained late into the after hours of the school. The student council had increased their focus in the student body. Ahead of her walked the student council president herself, Sona. She never really paid much attention to her, but she was respected for her authority and pride in the school. She walked opposite to her gaze fixed at a single point ahead of her, radiating confidence and pride. She felt her own gaze falter to the ground. She wished she was as strong as the student council president, but she just wasn't. She sped her steps up, she didn't want to stay in her presence for long, but as she walked past a girl who walked opposite, she heard the steps stop. After a few short steps more, she found herself stopping as well. Your name is Cadis, is that correct? She closed her eyes and tilted her head down. The way Sona had asked was a rhetorical question, and her tone made that evident without much work. Yes, her reply to Sona was even less motivated. She sounded sad, like a dog who had been yelled at for something wrong. I know. You have changed, haven't you? Since the news of him came to our school, you've been changing. She said to her tone unwavering. Everyone has wanted to escape the situation. You're running away from the question. You took the news of his death hard and then lit back up when he was revealed to be alive, but now that he hasn't been in touch with the school, you seem to have grown more down. Sona pride, Cadis looked down more, doing her best to cover her face with her pink hair. I miss him, okay? I guess you could say I like him, I have for a while, but I was too afraid of what other girls would think to say anything. I don't care anymore, I'm ashamed. I'm sorry, I want to talk to him. To try and fix things. She replied, tears starting to stream down her face and fall to the floor below. I want to see him, but he is so far away now, and I'm happy for him. I'm happy he found people who would give him a new family, but I'm not strong. I want to see him, I miss him, and it hurts. It's something I can't explain. I am beginning to understand. You can stop now. I'm not sure if this will ease your mind or not, but he is still enrolled as a student here. If there were no intentions of him coming back to attend school here, he would have been taking off our rosters, and if that's not enough for you to believe, just wait. I have no more than I could ever explain, but soon, you will discover for yourself. Sona said, her words colliding with Cadis's mind and causing her tears to stop as her focus was averted to the war inside her head. Is he coming back? How do you know? She stammered over her own words. Like I said, I know things, and you will come to understand soon enough. So far, you, the orc, and the student council are the only ones that know this. So, keep it a secret. Truth is, I don't know why I decided to tell you, it was a gamble, but I trust you will follow your emotions all the way through, and then you would have found out anyways. she said as she began to walk away from Caddis, never turning back. Found out what? She turned, her eyes red from recently shed tears that still trickled down her face. She turned around, confusion etched onto her face, and continued her walk home. Once she had left the school building, after walking almost endlessly through the ghostly halls of her school that were only accompanied by the occasional maintenance man, she found herself in the courtyard. The afternoon air was nippy, and the wind bit at her skin as it echoed through the empty yard. The sky above was cloudy and a hazy gray, allowing just enough light to pass through to make everything around her noticeable. The trickling of water filled her tickled ears along with a whistle of wind to form a duet of music that pulled on her heartstrings. It was peaceful, and she felt her muscles relax as she focused on the beautiful porcelain fountain that decorated the courtyard and admired its beauty from afar. It was pleasant to watch the fountain shoot water into the air in thick streams that fell to the next layer, where the process repeated with steady waterfalls to the base layer. She moved through the courtyard, looking down as she stepped on white tiles. She hadn't noticed before, but the patches of grass and granite epoxy mixed tiles made the courtyard beautiful. She enjoyed the decorations and colors that came from the flower garden at the base of the fountain, which was all carefully maintained by the Kaizen committee. Of course, the flowers, tiles, and grass were recent additions to the school courtyard, and it used to be barren, but it was decided after the supposed loss of Issei that the pavement would be removed and replaced. A week later, the cultivation of the land that was left had begun. She stopped walking before the garden. At her feet was a sign that she had come to cherish and visit once a day. The Hyodo Garden. They were the flowers at the Hyodo residency, and she came to know each of them by heart: chrysanthemum, zinnia, cornflowers, and camellias. She had come to love their deeper meanings because they intrigued her and became something she would never forget. Honesty, remembrance, fortune, and life. She loved them. She hoped inwardly that Issei knew their meaning too. Her phone dinged in her pocket. She reached and pulled the device from her pocket and hit the power button. Her eyes widened and her hands began to shake as her mind began to register what her phone screen wrote. One unread message. Issei Hyodo 3. I forgive you. I never blamed you, and I never thanked you for making my time. She scanned her fingerprint, her heart pounding in her chest violently enough to shake her vision and rock her body. She opened the message as fast as she could with 2 taps and read the rest. Enjoyable at Kuo. I'm sorry for my peeping, and I hope you forgive me. Don't feel sorry for me, I'm sure we will see each other again. As far as how I am? Well, I'm better than I was. I have a reason to live again. I want to come back to Kuo, and I hope I will be allowed to, somehow, someway. I'll talk to you later, I've got to go. It was nice to finally talk to you. Tears rolled down her face and fell to the garden below. She felt something behind her, and she turned, her tears flinging to her sides. Behind her, in the doorway stood Sona, her eyes peering at her from a side glance, but not just staring at her, staring through her. She walked past, leaving the doorway and leaving her alone. She knew then that Sona knew something she didn't know about Issei. The look she gave her was enough to tell her she was being watched. She turned back to her phone and typed a response. Don't apologize, I'm the one that is sorry. I would love to talk to you later, Issei promised me. I miss you. She hesitated to send the message at the end, but sent it regardless, not caring about the words she used. She turned once more, this time looking towards the old schoolhouse, the meeting room of the occult research club, and her eyes met with deep light blue ones. She turned quickly and began to leave the school, happy at the outcome of the day. She moved with purpose as she quickly walked through the school gates and began to walk the sidewalk on the left side of the road towards her house. From the window of the old school building, sky blue eyes followed her from the window with great interest. Beautiful crimson hair accented the delicate features of the girl who watched Caddis leave the school with tears or happiness in her eyes. The girl knew why Caddis was happy, it was easy to tell. She hummed to herself happily. He has awoken. She spoke to herself, a smile grazing her face. Issei, we need you. I need you. It was nice to finally talk to you. He finished typing his message and pressed send. He lowered the phone below the table he had been sitting at and moved the device into his pocket. He frowned inwardly, he hadn't even looked at the messages his friends had sent, but he knew they were all going to be similar. Regardless, he felt bad that he didn't spare them a second of his time, but he didn't feel like talking much. He didn't know why he even replied to Caddis. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, a flash of red came to him. He kept his eyes closed, curious about the red he was seeing that now began to expand before him. His original fears of the situation had been eaten by his outstanding amounts of curiosity to the shifting red mist before him that he swore radiated warmth into his body. The mist began to form shapes around him, and soon he was looking at an almost replica of the room he was in. Everything was misty red, like evil silhouettes. He cocked his head down, as his vision was handled by something beyond his imagination. The earth below the floor of the building he was in boomed with the energy. Pure and completely colored without the smallest splotch of space in between. It all flowed in one direction, never moving back if it was possible to even see a direction. When he focused close enough, he saw a flowing motion, but he couldn't tell if it was true or if his brain deceived him. He tried to focus more and was bombarded with emotions from nowhere almost immediately. Tears came to his eyes and he failed to understand why, but he knew the emotions. The place he was in was screaming comfort, love, hope, and trust. He opened his eyes and looked across from him. The younger girl who he had scared before was across from him, tapping him with her toes under the table. Hey. The small girl was certainly younger than him, maybe 3 or 4 years younger at best, but her voice sounded more refined than what a child's would be, and it was almost on a level that would be high school student worthy. He looked at the girl and her golden eyes that shone at him like bright, curious little stars. He bowed his head to her, deeply as a sign of apology. I'm sorry for everything I did. I didn't mean to scare you, I was just afraid. I sincerely didn't mean to harm you in any way. I know this is a lot to ask, but could you find it in your heart to forgive me? The girl looked at him as he bowed. The bowing to her was something she was used to, yes, but not like this. Not from her future and potential, never mind. She backpedaled at the table, a blush gracing her facial features. She stammered over her own words. And no. You don't have to apologize, you didn't hurt me. Besides, she lowered her head now to cover herself with the hair she had. Her final words came out as a mumble. I'm sorry, what was that last part? Issei asked, cocking his head to the side slightly. She looked up at him, her golden eyes peering into him in curiosity she wanted to explore. How could she help herself? She never spoke to many people, and she hardly had many friends, so the man that sat in front of her was curious to her, to say the least. She thought quickly about how to reply to fix her situation. Telling the truth about what she actually said was too embarrassing. It's okay. I have nothing to forgive you for, I can't imagine what you've been through, so I think the reaction is acceptable and understandable, and besides, it's not like you severely hurt anyone, they are all making an easy recovery. She worked her words in a way to make it sound better than it was. It worked as she got her expected reaction from him. His eyes eased slightly, and he seemed to have a weight lifted off him. I'm glad that you forgive me then. Well, how about we start over? I'm Issei, and I hope we get along well. The girl looked at him with her head tilted slightly as her eyes sparkled like liquid glass. The way he had said it made it seem like he had a sadness that still washed over him. She could feel it radiate from him in waves as it slammed into her senses that were still so new to her. I'm sure me and I will get along very well, Issei. My name is Kunu, it's wonderful to meet you. She was enthusiastic and quick to respond. She hoped it was a good step forward in the right direction. Issei never got to reply, as Yusaka had finished preparing the food they were going to eat and called it out to them. It was only a few seconds later that she laid most of the food out on the table, neatly in front of them both. They didn't dare take the food until she was finished, but instead they admired the intricacy of the food and how it was arranged before them. It looked like something from a food novel. Before them were 3 bowls of rice, grilled chicken breasts cooked in pepper, and various seasonings, complete with parsley, and a neatly made omelette with basil cooked in. The aromatics of the food hit his nose and caused his mouth to salivate. They looked down at the food and wouldn't dare eat before Yusaka had joined. Luckily, it wasn't long before Yusaka joined the two at the table, and they soon after dug in. As soon as his tongue made contact with the food, his stomach pounded and convulsed. It felt like someone had hit him in his stomach with a sledgehammer swung by the might of a professional swinger who was angered. He swallowed the food immediately, taking no time to hardly chew as the hunger shadowed his mind. Whoa, slow down. We don't want you to choke. It's been a while since I've last performed CPR. Yusaka said, teasing him and causing him to slow as a small shade of red came to his face. The 3 of them continued eating, enjoying themselves and the heavenly food that Yusaka had prepared. So Issei, how are you feeling now? Yusaka asked, finishing her food and laying her utensils down. I feel a lot better now, thanks to you. The food was delicious. He replied, following in her pursuit and laying his utensils aside. Well. I'm glad you enjoyed it, I really am. I'm also quite happy you're eating, most people I've seen don't eat a lot after what you've been through. I'm glad to know that you have a strong enough will to hold your head high. Yusaka said to him, smiling at him widely. He didn't need to think much to know what she was referring to, but he smiled at her regardless. The pain wasn't as much for him anymore. Yeah, it still saddened him, but he felt focused and eased by some outside source. Well, it may be strange, but I feel at ease. I feel more focused. I have moments where I think I feel worried and nervous, but then it's like a fire in me consumes them, and I'm just calm. I know that sounds strange. He tried to explain to her. Actually, quite the opposite. I'm still learning about you myself, but Issei. You are a dragon. I don't mean some normal human with a dragon soul inside him, no. You are fully linked with your sacred gear. You are it, and it is you. You are the only one who has ever gone so far that we know of. You are the closest thing to a dragon and human hybrid the supernatural world knows of. In fact, you are already becoming one of the biggest table talks since the last war. Yusaka explained, stopping herself from becoming too excited about the boy. He nodded as his thoughts moved fast. He knew he was a dragon now, Drake told him that, and he knew that the dragon was without a doubt powerful, but he wasn't entirely sure of the supernatural world around him, and he wanted to know more. The last war. The question was simple, but he felt it was important and contained loads of information. Yes. I suppose it's natural you would be interested. Well, to put it simply, a long time ago there was a war that raged between the fallen angels, and devils. She began to explain to him. He nodded, listening intently as Kunu went for seconds, as though she heard the story a million times. The war was a long one and almost wiped most of the factions involved. In fact, most of them started dying out, and since most supernatural beings have extremely long lives, it's harder for them to produce offspring. As a result, they produced a certain reincarnation system to revive humans into their ranks and turn them into devils. As did the angels. A reincarnation system to turn humans into devils and angels? Is there a system for fallen angels? He asked, expecting to gain more valuable info that would assist him with his new situation. Not for fallen angels. You see, as long as there are angels bringing new angels in, some will always fall, and that's how fallen acquire their members. Devils acquire their members through the evil P system, which is based on a game of chess pieces. The angel system is based on a deck of cards. We will talk more about those two later. I believe you knew two devils at your school in Kuo, Ria's Gremory and Sona's Citri. Wait, what? Issei almost jumped at that. That was insane news to him, and he was intrigued to say the least. His mind worked in overdrive. Does that mean the student council and the orc are all devils? That is correct. Sona Citri is the king of her peerage and Ria's Gremory is the king of her group as well. I was actually hoping you would go back and aid Ria's in something very soon to help bring my group and devils closer. An alliance of sorts. Yusaka explained to him further. Wow, so I was going to school with devils and didn't even know it was unbelievable. And, Drake has told me you were a fox. So, what faction does that make you ask, testing his own curiosity. I am a Yokai. I'm the leader of the Kyoto Yokai faction. The nine-tailed fox. Yusaka replied simply. His confusion grew more. He didn't want to confuse himself anymore. He wanted to ask how Kunu came to be, but he figured it wasn't a good subject. So how did I end up with you? I was so close to two groups of devils, so how did they not get me first? The question he asked was good, and he hoped it would answer the questions he wanted deep down. His eyes went blank as they stared deep into her golden ones. She seemed to be deep in thought and conflict with herself. Perhaps it wasn't a polite way to treat someone who had given him a new life, but he needed to know. My life is bound to Kyoto, Issei. So I'm very limited as to what I can do personally, but when I felt the power of the red dragon I had to come to you immediately. I did everything I could to ensure your survival personally, and I would do it all again if I had to. The dragon inside you is a heavenly dragon. I didn't think you would want to live a life as a devil, so I laid claims to you myself. Doing so kept you human, but restricted what you were physically and magically capable of. Yusaka replied with full eyes. She was trustworthy, and he couldn't sense an ounce of heinous intention. The main reason he wanted to know and pray so much was because he wanted to know if her saving him was for some personal gain for her. He wanted to know if she was just going to use him. I know it probably sounds like I'm just using you, and that couldn't be any more false. I have no intention to force you to do anything. You made the choice to become a full dragon, and you will be able to make many other choices like that. If you don't wish to help Rias, so be it. If you don't want to help in the alliance between the Yokai and devils, I won't force you. I only hope you do what's right. She continued. With that, his questions were answered, and he didn't have any reason to not trust Yusaka. He didn't have a reason not to trust her anyway, but now he knew for sure. He bowed to her, deeply, offering his highest respect. Thank you for your hospitality, Yusaka. I'm not sure how I could ever repay you. You don't have to repay me. Well actually. I haven't asked officially, but would you like to join us, Issei? Me and Kunu would love to have you, as well as the rest of the Yokai faction. She asked with a large smile. He looked up at her, and to put things simply, Yusaka was beautiful. She was like the sun with her golden hair and eyes. He averted his eyes to Kunu next, who shared the same bright smile. Looking at the two side by side, it was very easy to tell how similar they were. From the smile, the eyes, the hair, and gentle facial features. It would be an honor to join you. To him, the reply required little effort to form. Yusaka stood and moved beside him. She sat down and hugged him. He couldn't help himself, but let his thoughts wander as his shoulder pressed perfectly between her massive cleavage. Indeed, he was enjoying himself at the moment. Woo, there was a yell from outside, followed by several other yells and hoorays. He turned and looked at Yusaka in confusion. She looked at him with her bright gold eyes and explained with another smile. Those were my guards. They are happy to have you on their side. I'm sure the whole city will be celebrating you tonight. We will have to go watch what kind of show they will put on for you, Yusaka said, letting go of him and standing from her spot. Show? What do you mean? Issei was more than a little curious at what kind of show she was referring to. It appeared, though, he wouldn't receive a verbal description or hint of any sort. You'll see. The way she said that to him was borderline flirtatious, and the added wink at the end didn't help his confused manhood. He didn't know if he wanted to see her as a mother figure or something else, and that was beginning to fluster him more than it should. Well then, what's the plan now? Issei asked. Kunu stood as well, walking over and standing beside him. Well, I was thinking we could go out for a walk and talk for a bit. It would be nice, I could show you around the place and show you the beauties here, and since it's almost dark out anyways, it shouldn't be too long till the other yokai start celebrating. Yusaka said, holding her hand down for him to take. He reached up and took her hand. Smooth and silky soft skin met his coarse ones, and she pulled him up gently. Kunu stood fast beside him, and Yusaka didn't let go of his hand as they stood together. She began to walk, and Issei had to follow her. She guided him outside the home through a sliding door, and almost immediately his nose was filled with the sweetness of fresh air. His skin speckled from a chilled breeze, insect buzzing, and birds chirping filled his ear, and before him was a lush land of trees and bushes with leaves bigger than his body. Trees reached up tall, but were just short enough to allow plants below to grow fine. The smell that filled his lungs was fresh, and the air was humid from freshly falling rain. He was guided further by the hands of Yusaka and Kunu on a path of large stone steps that jutted out from dew-dripping grass and moist ground. The leaves above his head dropped down thick droplets of water onto his head, and soon he heard a steady trickling of water fill his ears. He looked at the two who were guiding him, and they seemed to be talking to each other happily, but his mind was focused on the scenery around him that was completely foreign to him. He looked at the sky that was still full with low-hanging gray clouds. It was becoming dark outside, and the cold was coming in by waves rapidly as they seemed to approach the stream he could only hear. New insects and birds joined into the rhythm of the night and sang their songs in different pitches as earlier creatures faded away slowly. He began to slow down with Yusaka, his hand still in hers. Kunu held his other hand as well, and she was pointing ahead while looking at him with bright eyes. See, Issei? I told you it was beautiful. Kunu said. Yusaka turned and backed up behind him, patting his shoulder. Before him was a stream of trickling water, weaving between stones so well smoothed and polished it looked almost unnatural, but he knew better as he looked at the moss that grew on the opposite side of the refined stones. Leaves danced together in the treetops behind him, the sound mixed with the trickling of the water perfectly, but the one key detail that made everything sparkle like a million stars in the night sky he couldn't see above was that there was a natural opening in the trees that allowed him to look down at the city below. Beautiful night light sparkled in the trickling stream, and he watched them intently. He turned his head and looked at Kunu, her eyes were big and bright, and in them, he could see the reflection of light shine like the stars he imagined them to be. Everything looked perfect as the night became fully dark. It was like the image came from a fantasy book. He turned and looked at Yusaka. The same beautiful shimmer of lights that were in Kunu's eyes sparkled behind hers as well. She looked back at him and smiled at him brightly. Look, Issei, it's about to start. It's for you, you wouldn't want to miss it. They will probably do something big. Issei was still curious what kind of thing they were going to do to celebrate, but his curiosity was soon lost as a single bright ball was launched in the sky, leaving behind a trail of gold sparkles, and a heavy streak of burning gold lingered behind it, spiraling like a helix. The bright burning gold ball traveled higher and higher up, almost reaching the clouds, but wheezing out at what looked to be just before. There was a loud thud, as though a gun had been shot somewhere in the city below. Suddenly, the sky lit up, and thousands of lights exploded in the sky in a large radius. A concussive blast moved clearly in the air, and the leaves around Issei shook and rustled violently. There was an explosion that filled his ears and shook him to his core. Shortly after, there followed a series of lesser explosions. His eyes filled with hundreds of colored explosions of many designs with compact centers. Wow. That's the biggest one I've ever seen. Kunu exclaimed, eyes filled with excitement and amazement. He looked up at the twinkling fireworks with her. However, the singular firework was far from being done. Hundreds of other fires blew up, these ones caused from the same first firework. Many exploded above their head, and hundreds more filled the sky completely, beautiful white, gold, and blue expanding to their furthest point before they began to fall to the ground and leave a long golden trail of light with them. The sheer radius that one firework alone had was extraordinary, and the fact there were hundreds of other fireworks that came after made the whole thing breathtaking. And with the first firework ending, more began to set off below. Arms wrapped around him from behind, and without looking, he knew it was Yusaka. She moved behind him, and he felt her hot breath on his neck. The first one was in celebration for you. Now as for the getting to know each other part. Earlier you asked about my husband. I don't have one. I haven't had one, and Kunu over there has never had a father. Or anyone to look up to as a father, for that matter. Yusaka said, her arm squeezed him harder, pulling him closer as he could only stare ahead at the magnificent flashing lights. He looked at Kunu, her eyes glued to the firework display, and he swore he saw tears swelling in the side of her eyes. She always wanted to see the fireworks with her father. She loved them so much. He reached up and grabbed her arm. He didn't know if his action would help any, but he figured it would bring some amount of comfort regardless. She continued, I would always take her to see them. He took a step forward towards Kunu, letting Yusaka's arms fall down to her side. She brought one up to caress her arms as she watched Issei move to her daughter. He stood beside the young girl and began to talk to her while watching the fireworks. They are beautiful, aren't they, Kunu? Issei asked the girl. She turned and looked at him with her same teary and star-speckled eyes. She took a step closer to him and pinched the sleeve of his right arm, holding him from moving. They are amazing. I've wanted to see the big one for a long time. I've never seen anything like it. It covered the whole sky. Her excitement dripped with her words, and Issei smiled at her enthusiasm. Yeah, wasn't it? I haven't seen anything quite like it either. He replied to her, crouching down near her. You know, I've always loved watching the fireworks. My parents used to take me all the time when I was younger, but for the last 5 or so years they had always been busy with work. The girl grabbed his arm. He didn't know why he was saying the things he was, it wasn't his place to insert himself, and to him, he felt out of place. He thought continuing the conversation with her would lead him to hallowed ground that he wasn't sure he wanted to tread on. He wasn't even sure how he would approach the subject. He had a father. This girl never had one to begin with. He had someone to miss, she missed someone who simply never existed. How do you even begin to approach that? I'm sorry. Now that they are gone, I can't help but feel drawn to what's still in front of me. I didn't mean to ruin the mood or anything, I was just thinking that we should get to know each other better. Issei said to the girl who still looked out at the fireworks with the same expression of happiness. You're amazing, how do you do it? Kinu asked him, moving closer and pulling his arm around her shoulders. His mouth hung open slightly with words forming that he couldn't get out. I was born into a life like this, and you were born into a normal life. The life without the supernatural, and yet you've seen things I couldn't imagine. Things I couldn't handle. Things I know I will see. You've had everything you have ever known, stripped away from you by someone for no reason, so, how do you do it? How are you finding time to try and help me when you hardly know me? He had no idea how to reply. She was right. He hardly knew her at all, the only thing he knew was that her mother was trying to give him a life worth living. He owed it to her mother to try, but he knew deep inside that there was more to his reason than that. He wasn't obliged to help instructed, he didn't look down at his hands. It wasn't like he could give her a solution to the problem. Everyone behind him. I know why you came backed away from him. My mother told you about how I wanted to see the fireworks with my father. She could tell the wind wasn't natural, really, but if the others never had a father to miss, I've never had one to look up to. It moved after a while it just fades away. And when it reached him, the grass twisted around him. He was in over his head, and leaves joined the fray. He didn't know what to do, spun around him, making the scene look like he was the eye of a miniature tornado. But she didn't tell me to come over here. She wanted me to know, so I could amount of magic. I came over here because I wanted to. I wanted to learn these things from you personally. And to the untrained eyes it wasn't something noticeable. Right. The power that created an almost barrier-like presence around him was a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of colors. So if you have some you far wilder and more foreign than anything the only thing I can say to you now, to anyone who is weak to magic, is that the girl almost sickening fireworks and clearly enough to make high-class things in our lives think twice before fighting. And that's all right. She had another idea as she felt the repercussions of such brutal power. But it's important to not let those things ruin the good. She could train him how to suppress it, and that was no easy feat to accomplish. It's important it was a brilliant green light because sometimes what is truly important to us is in front of us the whole time. weapon was in Issei's finished what he said. It was sounding like some old wise man who had seen the end of time. The handle of the weapon was long like a staff, and he wouldn't have ever said two hands. But something just clicked with the words, easily 4 feet long if not longer. He said them. If the handguard was at Issei's waist, the sword still much as he hoped he could one day take his exactly what weapon it was. Why when did he become so wise? She knew exactly how to use it. Behind him, it was an Eastern weapon. He turned back and faced Issei. She smiled at him with a new happiness. Just at the rise of her creation. I guess the same way everybody else becomes wise. It was often called a sword staff really because of its unorthodox, he said, and looking down at the ground, the blade itself was curved only slightly less than the traditional katana, which made the sword look more like the Japanese adachi, and were clearly almost finished. The thing that stood out about this particular weapon that made it neither Japanese nor Chinese. She looked up at him as he turned away and looked at the fireworks the abnormally long show. It wasn't just felt anything that could help her accurately. It was the actual shape of the metal carved into a single dragon rendering. She wouldn't forget what he said to her. The metal itself had a pattern almost like flowing water, and it was a beautiful red color. She felt tears sting at her eyes. The handle was black with a gold band, and she fought back as much as she could to prevent her dragon that resembled how she remembered Drake to look at a capital T. She lunged into him and wrapping her arms around him in every crying into the soft fabric. It was almost a perfect blend of two types of weapons with a style into his chest as he patted her head in a caring embrace. It even looked perfectly balanced for his height. And she wondered how he had imagined while she watched the remaining fireworks. He turned, her mother came, and grabbed the two in one hand together, and they watched the remaining fireworks. I did as a group of three held together in a big embrace. I didn't think about it being so large. I also didn't imagine the dragon, and they were left staring at the massive cloud of smoke at the fireworks, walking the sword over to Yusaka for her closer inspection. After only a few seconds of silence, once he stopped in front of her, Yusaka spoke the sword, and almost instantly, that was beautiful. It acted against her. How about we head back inside? When the sword caught even the slightest glimmer of light, she saw fingers dancing in the reflection, acting out grotesque and contorted faces of pain. She said, while other figures were engaged so they could performing acts of tortures that she saw only moments after would truly show how much Issei had long since passed, a time where she had only known tugged his arm down. She had been alive for a very long time. Can I ride on your shoulders? And if she had learned anything, she was shocked at how her daughter had acted towards Issei already. That humans were capable of atrocities far worse than developed a strong trust for him. Humans were capable of inducing horrors that would even force complete demons to reevaluate his own methods. And he hoisted her. The thing about this, she locked her legs around his chest from the darkest depths of her memory that she tried so hard to hide away was impressive, and it was almost like a warning for anyone who would never know how much he had helped her today alone. It was surrounded in a mystery to she couldn't even begin to understand, and grabbed his left just how powerful his mother went up to first wizard still held, and now she moved his hand down to her side, and together they moved back. She wanted to know how all of this came to be. Thanks for watching this video, and she had never thought about anything more than this. If you really enjoyed this video, deciding to test her luck and comment down below and turn on that bell notification. It was a right, and also check out her right leg was forward that I have created, and her left was behind it, almost as if she was preparing for a lunge. See you in the next video. The sword was to her, the right which left her left